The Hunter's Wife, a short story. It was the hunter's first time outside Montana. He woke stricken still with the hours-old version of ascending through rose-lit cumulus of houses and barns like specks down in the snowed-in valleys, all the scrolling country below looking December. Brown and black hills streaked with snow, flashes of iced-over lakes, the long braids of a river gleaming at the bottom of the canyon. Above the wing, the sky had deepened to a blue so pure he knew it would bring tears to his eyes if he looked long enough. Now it was dark. The airplane descended over Chicago, its galaxy of electric lights, the vast neighborhoods, coming clearer as the plane glided toward the airport. Streetlights, headlights, stacks of buildings, ice rinks, a truck turning at a stoplight, scraping of snow atop a warehouse, and the winking antenna on a faraway hill. Finally, the long converging parallels of blue runaway lights, and they were down. He walked into the airport, past the bank of the monitors. Already he felt as if he'd lost something, some beautiful perspective, some lovely dream fallen away. He had come to Chicago to see his wife, whom he had not seen in 20 years. She was there to perform her magic for higher up at the state university. Even the universities, apparently, were interested in what she could do. Outside the terminal, the sky was thick and gray and hurried by wind. Snow was coming. A woman from the university met him and escorted him to her jeep. He kept his gaze out the window. They were in the car for 45 minutes, passing first the tall, lighted architecture of downtown, then naked suburban oaks, heaps of plowed snow, gas stations, power towers, and telephone wires. The woman said, "So you regularly attend your wife's performances?" "No," he said, "never before." She parked in the driveway of an elaborate modern mansion with square balconies suspended over two garages, huge triangular windows in the facade, sleek columns, domed lights, a steep shale roof. Inside the front door, about 30 name tags were laid out on a table. His wife was not there yet. No one apparently was there yet. He found his tag and pinned it to his sweater. A silent girl in a tuxedo appeared and disappeared with his coat. The granite foyer was black with a grand staircase, which spread wide at the bottom and tapered at the top. A woman came down. She stopped 4 or 5 steps from the bottom and said, "Hello, Anne," to the woman who had driven him there, and "You must be Dumas," to him. He took her hand, pale, bony thing, weightless, like a featherless bird. Her husband's university counselor was just knotting his bow tie, she said, and she laughed sadly to herself, as if bow ties were something she disapproved of. The hunter moved to the window, shifted aside the curtain, and peered out. The poor light, he could see a wooden deck, the length of a house, angled and stepped, its width ever-changing, with a low rail. Beyond it, in blue shadows, a small pond laid encircled by hedges, with a marble bird bath at its center. Behind the pond stood leafless trees, oaks, maples, a sycamore as white as bone. A helicopter shuttled past its green light winking. "It's snowing," he said. "Is it?" the hostess asked with an air of concern, perhaps false. It was impossible to tell what was sincere and what was not. The woman who had driven him here had moved to the bar, where she had cradled a drink and stared at into the carpet. He let the curtain fall back. The counselor came down to the staircase. The other guests fluttered in. A man in a gray corridor with Bruce Maples on his name tag approached him. "Mr. Dumas," he said, "your wife isn't here yet?" "You know her?" the hunter asked. "Oh, no." Maple said as he shook his head. No, I don't. He spread his legs and swiveled his hips as if stretching before a foot race. But I've read about her. The hunter watched as a tall, remarkably thin man stepped through the front door. Hollows behind his jaw and beneath his eyes made him appear ancient and skeletal, as if he were visiting from some other, leaner world. The chancellor approached the thin man, embraced him, and held him for a moment. That's President O'Brien, Maple said. A famous man, actually, to people who follow those sorts of things. So terrible what happened to his family. Maple stabbed the ice in his drink with a straw. For the first time, the hunter began to think he should not have come. Have you read your wife's books? Maple asked. The hunter nodded. In her poems, her husband is a hunter. I guided hunters. He was looking out the window to where snow was settling on the hedges. Does it ever bother you? What? Killing animals. For a living, I mean. The hunter watched snowflakes disappear as they touched the window. Was that what hunting meant to people? Killing animals? He put his finger to the glass. No, he said. It doesn't bother me. The hunter met his wife in Great Falls, Montana, in the winter of 1972. That winter arrived all at once. You could watch it come. Twin curtains of white appeared in the north, white all the way to the sky, driving south like the end of all things. Cattle galloped to the fence line, brawling. Trees toppled, a barn roof tumbled over the highway. The river changed directions. The wind flung thrushes screaming through the gorse and impaled them on the thorns in grotesque attitudes. She was a magician's assistant, beautiful 15-year-old, an orphan. It was not a news story, a glittery red dress, long legs, traveling magic show performing in the meeting hall at the Central Christian Church. He had never felt such a wind. It had him pinned. His face was pressed against a low window, and through it he could see a show. The magician was a small man in a dirty blue cape. Above him, a sagging banner read, "The Great Vespucci." But the hunter watched only the girl. She was graceful, young, smiling, like a wrestler. The wind held him against the window. The magician was buckling the girl into a plywood coffin, which was painted garnishly with red and blue bolts of lightning. Her neck and head stuck out at one end, her ankles and feet at the other. She beamed. No one had ever before smiled so broadly at being locked in a coffin. The magician started up the electric saw and brought it noisily down through the center of the box, sawing her in half. Then he wheeled her apart, her legs going one way, her torso another. Her neck fell back, her smile faded. Her eyes showed only white. The lights dimmed. A child screamed. "Wiggle your toes," the magician ordered, flourishing his magic wand. She did, and her disembodied toes wiggled in glittery, high-heeled pumps. The audience squealed with delight. The hunter watched her pink, fine-boned face, her hanging hair, her outstretched throat. Her eyes caught in the spotlight. Was she looking at him? Did she see his face pressed against the window? The wind slashing at his neck, the groceries, onions, a sack of flour, tumbled to the ground at his feet. She was beautiful to him, in a way that nothing else had ever been beautiful. Snow blew down his collar and drifted around his boots. After some time, the magician rejoined the severed box halves, unfastened the buckles, and fluttered his wand. She was whole again. She climbed out of the box and curtsied her glittered dress. She smiled as if it were a resurrection itself. Then the storm brought down a pine tree in front of the courthouse, and the power winked out, streetlight by streetlight. before she could move, before the ushers could begin escorting the crowd out with flashlights. The hunter was slinking into the halls, making for the stage, calling for her. She was 30 years old, twice her age. He was 30 years old, twice her age. She smiled at him, leaned over from the dais in the red glow of the emergency exit light, and shook her head. "Show's over," she said. In his pickup, he trailed the magician's van through the blizzard to her next show, a library fundraiser in the boot. The next night, he followed her to Missoula. He rushed to the stage after each performance. Just eat dinner with me," he pleaded. "Just tell me your name." It was hunting by persistence. She said yes in Bozeman. Her name was plain, Mary Roberts. They had rhubarb pie in a hotel restaurant. "I know how you do it," he said. "The feet in the box are dummies. You hold your legs against your chest and wiggle the dummy's feet with a string." She laughed. "Is that what you do? Follow a girl from town to town and tell her magic isn't real?" "No," he said. "I hunt." "And when you're not hunting?" "I dream about hunting." She laughed again. "It's not funny," he said. "You're right," she said and smiled. "It's not funny. I'm that way with magic. I dream about it, even when I'm not asleep." He looked into his plate, thrilled. He searched for something he might say. They ate. "But I dream bigger dreams, you know," she said afterwards. After she had eaten 2 pieces of pie, carefully, with a spoon, her voice was quiet and serious. "I have magic inside of me. I'm not going to get sawed in half by Tony Vespucci all my life." "I don't doubt it," the hunter said. "I know you'd believe me," she said. But the next winter, Vespucci brought her back to the Great Falls and sawed her in half in the same plywood coffin. And the winter after that, both times after the performance, the hunter took her to Bitterroot Diner, where he watched her eat 2 pieces of pie. The watching was his favorite part. A hitch in her throat as she swallowed, the way the spoon slid cleanly out of her lips, the way her hair fell over her ear. Then she was 18, and after pie, she let him drive her to his cabin, 40 miles from Great Falls, up the Missouri, and then to the East Smith River Valley. She brought only a small vinyl purse. The truck skidded and sheared as he steered it over the unplowed roads, fishtailing in deep snow. But she didn't seem afraid or worried about where he might be taking her, about the possibility of the truck might sink into a drift, that she might freeze to death in her peacoat and glittery magician's assistant's dress. Her breath plumbed out in front of her. It was 20 degrees below zero. Soon the roads would be snowed over, impassable until spring. At his one-room cabin, with furs and old rifles on the wall, he unbolted the door to the crawl space and showed her his winter hoard, 100 smoked trout, plucked pheasant, and venison quarters hanging frozen from the hooks. Enough for two of me," he said. She scanned his books over the fireplace, a monograph on grouse habits, a series of journals on unplayed game, bird, a thick tome titled simply Bear. "Are you tired?" he asked. "Would you like to see something?" He gave her a snowsuit, strapped her boots into a pair of leather snowshoes, and took her to hear the grizzly. She wasn't bad on snowshoes, a little clumsy. They went cracking over the wind-scalped snow into the near unbearable cold. The bear denned every winter in the same hollow cedar, the top of which had been shorn off by storm. Black, 3-fingered, and huge in the starlit, it resembled a skeletal hand thrust up from the ground. A ghoulish visitor scrambling its way out of the underworld. They knelt above them. The stars were knife points, hard and white. "Put your ear here," he whispered. The breath that carried his words crystallized and blew away. They listened face to face, the ears over woodpecker holes in the trunk. She heard it after a minute, turning her ears to something like a drowsy sigh, a long exaltation of slumber. Her eyes widened. A full minute passed. She heard it again. "We can see him," he whispered, "but we have to be dead quiet. Grizzlies are light hibernators. Sometimes all you do is step on twigs outside their dens and they're up." He began to dig at the snow. She stood back, her mouth open, eyes wide, bent at the waist. The hunter baled the snow back through his legs. He dug down 3 feet, then encountered a smooth, icy crust covering a large hole at the base of the tree. Gently, he dislodged the plates of ice and lifted them aside. From the hole, the smell of the bear came to her, like a wet dog, like a wild mushroom. The hunter removed some leaves. Beneath was a shaggy flank, a patch of brown fur. "He's on his back," the hunter whispered. "This is his belly. His forelegs must be up here somewhere." He pointed to a place higher on the trunk. She put one hand on his shoulder and knelt the snow behind her den. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. Her jaws hung open. Her shoulder, a star separated itself from the galaxy and melted through the sky. "I want to touch him," she said. Her voice sounded loud and out of place. "In that wood, under the naked cedar?" "Hush," he whispered. He shook his head no. "Just for a minute?" "No," he hissed. "You're crazy." He tugged at her arm. She removed the mitten from her hand and with her teeth and reached down. He pulled at her again, but lost his footing and fell back, clutching an empty mitten. He watched, horrified. She turned and placed both hands, spread-fingered, in the thick shag of a bear's chest. She lowered her face, as if drinking from a snowy hollow, and her lips pressed her lips to the bear's chest. Her entire head was inside the tree. She felt the soft silver tips of the fur brush against her cheek. Against her nose, one huge rib flexed slightly. She heard the lungs fill and then empty. She heard blood slug through the veins. "Want to know what he dreams?" she asked. Her voice echoed through the tree and poured from the shorn ends of the hollow branches. The hunter took his knife from his coat. "Summer!" her voice echoed. "Blackberries. Trout dredging his Summer," her voice echoed. "Blackberries. Trout dredging his flanks across river pebbles." I'd have liked," she said later, back in the cabin as he built up the fire, "to crawl all the way down there with him, to get in his arms. I'd grab him by the ears and kiss him on the eyes." The hunter watched the fire, the flames cutting and sawing, each log a burning bridge. 3 years he had waited for this. 3 years he had dreamt this girl by his fire. But somehow it had ended up different from what he had imagined. He had thought it would be like a hunt, like waiting hours beside a wallow with his rifle barrel on his pack to see a huge antlered head of a bull elk loom up against the sky, to hear the whole herd behind him inhale, then scatter down the hill. If you had your opening, you shot and walked the animal down, and that was it. But this was different. It was exactly as if he were still 3 years younger, stopped outside the Central Christian Church, and driven against a low window by the wind or some other greater force. "Stay with me," he whispered to her. "To the fire. Stay the winter." Bruce Maple stood behind him, jabbering the ice in his drink with a straw. "I'm in athletics," he offered. "I run the athletics department here." "You mentioned that. Did I? I don't remember. I used to coach track, hurdles." The hunter watched the thin, stricken man, President O'Brien, as he stood in the corner of the reception room. Every few minutes, a couple of guests made their way to him and took O'Brien's hands in their own. "You probably know," the hunter told Maples, "that wolves are herders. Sometimes the people who track them will come to snag and prints will disappear, as if the entire pack just leaped into a tree and vanished. Eventually, they'll start to find tracks again, 30 or 40 feet away. People used to think it was magic, flying wolves. But all they did was jump, one great coordinated leap." Maples was looking around the room. "Huh? I wouldn't know about that." She stayed. The first time they made love, she shouted so loudly that coyotes climbed into the roof and hollowed down the chimney. He rolled off her, sweating. The coyotes coughed and chuckled all night, like children chattering in the yard, and he had nightmares. "Last night, you had 3 dreams. You dreamt you were a wolf each time," she whispered. "You were mad with hunger and running under the moon." Had he dreamed that? He couldn't remember. Maybe he talked in his sleep. In December, it never got warmer than 15 below. The river froze. Something he'd never seen. On Christmas Eve, he drove all the way to Helena to buy her figure skates. In the morning, they wrapped themselves head to toe in furs and went out to skate the river. She held him by the hips. They glided through the blue dawn, skating up the frozen coils and shoals, beneath the leafless alders and cottonwoods. Only the bare tips of Creek Widow shadowed above the snow. Ahead of them, vast white stretches of river faded into darkness. In the wind-polished bend, they came upon a dead heron, frozen by its ankles on the ice. It had tried to hack itself out, hammering with its beak first at the ice, entombing its feet, then at its own thin, scaly legs. When it finally died, it died upright, wings folded back, beak parted in some final desperate cry, legs like twin reeds rooted in the ice. She fell to her knees beside the bird. In its eyes, she saw her face, flatly reflected. "It's dead," the hunter said. "Come on, you'll freeze too." "No," she said. She slipped off her mitten and closed the heron's beak with her fist. Almost immediately, her eyes rolled back in her head. "Oh, wow," she moaned. "I can feel her." She stayed she stayed like that for a whole minute. The hunter standing over her, feeling the cold come up his legs, afraid to touch her as she knelt before the bird. Her hand turned white, then blue in the wind. Finally she stood. "We have to bury it," she said. That night, she lay stiff and would not sleep. It was just a bird, she said, unsure of what was bothering her, but bothered by itself. "We can't do anything for a dead bird. It was good that we buried it, but tomorrow, something will find it, and will dig it out." She turned to him. Her eyes were wide. He remembered how they had looked when she touched her hands to the bear. "When I touched her," she said, "I saw where she went." "What?" "I saw where she went when she died. She was on the shore of a lake with the other herons, 100 others, all facing the same direction, and they were wading among stones. It was dawn, and they watched the sun come up over the trees on the other side of the lake. I saw it clearly, as if I were there." He rolled on his back and watched shadows shift across the ceiling. "Winter is getting to you," he said. He resolved to make sure that she went out every day. It was something he'd long believed Go out every day in the winter, or your mind will slip. Every winter, the paper was full of stories about ranchers' wives, snowed in, crazy with cabin fever, who had dispatched their husbands with cleavers and awes. Winter threw itself at the cabin. He took her out every day. He showed her 1,000 ladybugs hibernating in an orange ball hung in the riverbank hollow. A pair of dormant frogs buried in the frozen mud. Their blood crystallized until spring. He pried the globe of honeybees from its hive, slow buzzing, stunned from the sudden exposure, tightly packed around the queen, each bee shimmering for warmth. When he placed the globe in her hands, she fainted, her eyes rolled back. Lying there, she saw all their dreams at once. The winter reveries of scores of worker bees, each one fiercely vivid. Bright trails through thorns to a clutch of wild roses, honey, tiddly, brimming 100 comb. With each day, she learned more about what she could do. She felt a foreign, keen sensitivity bubbling in her blood, as if a seed planted long ago were now sprouting. The larger the animal, the more powerfully it could shake her. The recently dead were virtually minds, visions, casting them off with a slow fading strength, as if cutting a long series of tethers, one by one. She pulled off her mittens and touched everything she could. Bats, salamanders, a cardinal chick tumbling from its nest, still warm. 10 hibernating gardener snakes coiled beneath a rock, eyelids sealed, tongues stilled. Each time she touched a frozen insect, a slumbering amphibian, anything just dead, her eyes rolled back, and its visions, its heaven, went shivering through her body. The first winter passed like that. When he looked out the cabin window, he saw wolf track crossing the river, owls hunting from the trees, 6 feet of snow like a quilt ready to be thrown off. She saw burrowed dreamers' nests under roots against long twilight. Their dreams rippled through the sky like auroras. With love still lodged in her heart, like a splinter, he married her in the first muds of spring. Bruce Maples gasped when the hunter's wife finally arrived. She moved through the door like a shoe horse. Demurred in the way she kept her eyes down, but assured in her step. She brought each tapered heel down and struck it against the granite. The hunter had not seen his wife for 20 years, and she had changed, become refined, less wild, somehow to the hunter, worse for it. Her face had wrinkled around the eyes. She moved as if avoiding contact with anything near her, as if the hall table or the closet door might suddenly lunge forward to snatch her lapel. She wore no jewelry, no wedding ring, only a plain black suit, double-breasted. She found her name tag on the table and pinned it to her lapel. Everyone in the reception room looked at her and then looked away. The hunter realized that she was not President O'Brien. The hunter realized that she, not President O'Brien, was the guest of honor. In a sense, they were courting her. In their way, the Chancellor's way, the silent bartender, tuxedoed coat girls, big icy drinks gave her pie, the hunter thought, rhubarb pie. Show her a sleeping grizzly. They sat for dinner at the narrow and very long table, 15 or so high-backed chairs down each side and one at each end. The hunter was seated several places away from his wife. She looked over him, finally a look of recognition, of warmth, and then look away. He must have seemed old to her. He must always have seemed old to her. She did not look at him again. The kitchen staff, in starched whites, brought onion soup, scampi, poached salmon. Around the hunter, guests spoke in half whispers about the people he did not know. He kept his eyes on the windows and blowing snow beyond. The river thawed and drove huge saucers of ice toward the Missouri. The hunter felt that old stirring, that quickening in his soul. He would rise in a wide pink dawn, grab his fly rod, and hurry down the river. Already trout were rising through the chill brown water to take the first insects of spring. Soon the telephone in the cabin was ringing with the calls from clients, and his guiding season was on. In April, an occasional client wanted a mountain lion or a trip with dogs for birds, but late spring and summer were for trout. He was out every morning before dawn, driving with a thermos of coffee to pick up a lawyer, a widower, a politician with a perchance for wild cutthroat. He came home stinking of fish guts and woke her with eager stories. Native trout leaping 15-foot cataracts, a stubborn rainbow wedged under a snag. By June, she was bored and lonely. She wandered through the forest, but never very far. The summer woods were dense and busy, not like the quiet graveyard feel of winter. Nothing slept for very long. Everything was emerging from cocoons, winging about, buzzing, multiplying, having litters, gaining weight, bear cubs splashing in the river, chicks screamed for worms. She longed for the stillness of winter, in the long slumber, the bare sky, the bone-on-bone sound of bull elk knocking their antlers together, or against trees. In September, the big game hunters came. Each client wanted something different. Elk, antelope, bull moose, a doe. They wanted to see grizzlies, track a wolverine, shoot sandhill cranes. They wanted heads of 7x7 royal bulls for their dens. Every few days, he came home smelling of blood, with stories of stupid clients of the Texan who sat, wheezing out of shape to get to the tall top of a hill for a shot. A bloodthirsty New Yorker claimed he only wanted a photograph of black bears. Then he pulled out a pistol from his boot and fired wildly at 2 cubs and their mother. Nightly, she scrubbed blood out of the hunter's coveralls and watched it fade from rust to red to rose in a basin filled with river water. She began to sleep, taking long afternoon naps, 3 hours or more. Sleep, she learned, was a skill like any other, like getting sawed in half, reassembling, or like divining visions of a dead robin. She taught herself to sleep, despite heat, despite noise. Insects flung themselves at the screens, hornets spread down from the chimney, the sun angled hot and urgent through the southern windows. Still she slept. When he came home each autumn night, exhausted, forearms strained with blood, she was hours into sleep. Outside, the wind was already stripping leaves from cottonwood. Too soon, he thought. He'd taken her sleeping hand. Both of them lived in a grip of forces that they had no control over. The October wind, the revolutions of the earth. That winter was the worst he could remember. From Thanksgiving on, they were snowed in. The truck buried under 6-foot drifts. The phone line went down in December and stayed down until April. January began with a chinook followed by a terrible freeze. The next morning, 3-inch crust of ice covered the snow. On the ranches to the south, cattle crashed through and bled to death, kicking their way out. Deer punched through with their tiny hooves and suffocated in the deep snow beneath. Trails of blood veined the hills. In the morning, he would find coyote tracks written in the snow. In the morning, he would find coyote tracks written in the snow and around the door, to the crawl space, 2 inches of hardwood between them, and all his winter hoard hanging frozen beneath the floorboards. He reinforced the door with baking sheets, nailing them up against the wood over the hinges. Twice he woke to the sound of claws scraping against the metal and charging outside to shout the coyotes away. Everywhere he looked, something was dying. An elk kneeling over, an emancipated doe clattering into ice like a drunken skeleton. The radio reported huge cattle losses on the southern range. Each night he dreamt of wolves, running with them, soaring over fences, tearing into the steaming carcasses of cattle. In February, he woke to coyotes under the cabin. He grabbed his bow and knife and dashed out into the snow barefoot, his feet going numb. They had gone in under the door, chewing and digging the frozen earth under the foundation. He unbolted what was left of the door, swung it free. Elk arrows were all he had, aluminum shafts tipped with broadheads. He squatted in the dark entrance, their only exit, with the bow at full draw and the arrow nocked. Above him, he could hear his wife's feet pad quietly over the floorboards. Coyote made a coughing sound. Others shifted and panted. Maybe there were 10. He began to fire arrows steadily into the dark. He heard some bite into the foundation, blocks at the back of the crawl space. Others sink into the flesh. He spent a whole quiver, dozen arrows. The yelps of spread coyotes went up. A few charged him. He lashed at them with his knife. He felt teeth go to the bone of his arm. Felt hot breath on his cheeks. He lashed with his knife at ribs, tails, skulls. His muscles screamed. The coyotes were frenzied. Blood boomed from his wrist, his thigh. He heard the otherworldly scream of a wounded coyote come up through the floorboards, his grunts and curses as he fought. It sounded as if an exit had been tunneled all the way from hell to open up under their house. That was now pouring out, was the worst violence that place could send up. She knelt in front of the fireplace and felt the souls of coyotes as they went through the boards on their way skyward. He was blood-soaked and hungry, and his thigh had been badly bitten. But he worked all day digging into the truck. If he did not get food, they would starve. And he tried to hold the thought of the truck in his mind. He lugged state and tree bark to wedge under the tire, excavated a mountain of snow from the truck bed. Finally, after dark, he got the engine turned over and ramped the truck into the frozen, wind-crusted snow. For a brief, wonderful moment, he had careened over the icy crust, starlight washing through the windows, tires spinning, pistons churning, what looked to be road unspooled into the highlights. Then he crashed through, slowly, painfully. He began digging it out. It was hopeless. He would get it up, and then it would break through a few miles later. Hardly anywhere was the sheet of ice atop the snow thick enough to support the truck's weight. For 20 hours he dug, and then revved and slid the truck over 8-foot drifts. 3 more times it crashed through and sank to the windows. Finally he left it. He was 10 miles from home, 30 miles from town. He made a weak and smoky fire with cut bra and lay beside it and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. The heat of the fire melted snow and trickled land slowly toward him, but froze solid before they reached him. The stars, twisting in their constellations above, had never seemed farther or colder. In a state that was neither fully asleep nor fully waking, he watched wolves lope around his fire, just outside of the reaches of the light, slavering and lean. He thought for the first time that he might die if he did not get warmer. He managed to kneel and turn and crawl for home. Around him he could feel the wolves, smell blood on them, hear their nails scrape against the ice. He traveled all that night and all the next day near Catatonia, sometimes on his feet, more often on his elbows and knees. At times he thought he was a wolf, and at times he thought he was dead. When he finally made it to the cabin, there were no tracks on the porch, no sign that he had gone out. The crawl space door was still flung open. The shreds of sliding in the door frame lay scattered about. She was kneeling on the floor, ice in her hair, lost in some kind of hypodermic torpor. With his last dregs of energy, he constructed a fire and poured a mug of hot water down her throat. As he fell into sleep, he watched her himself from a distance, weeping and clutching his near-frozen wife. They had only flour and a few crackers in the cupboard. When she could speak, her voice was quiet and far away. "I dreamt about the most amazing things," she murmured. "I have seen the places where coyotes go and where they have gone. I know where spiders go and geese." Snow fell incessantly. Night was abiding. Daylight passed in a breath. The hunter was beyond hungry. Whenever he stood up, his eyelids fled in snow and nauseating streaks of color. He went out with lanterns to fish and shoveled down the river ice, chopped through with a maul, and shivered over the whole jigging in a ball of trout on a hook. Sometimes he brought back trout. Other times they ate squirrel, a hare, once a famished deer whose bones he cracked and boiled, or only a few handfuls of rose hips. In the worst parts of March, he dug out cattails to peel and steam of tubers. She hardly ate, sleeping 18-20 hours a day. When she woke, it was scribbled on a notebook paper before plummeting back into sleep. When she woke, it was to scribble on notebook paper before plummeting back to sleep, clutching at the blankets as if they gave her sustenance. There she was. She was learning strengths hidden at the center of weakness, ground at the bottom of the deepest pit, with her stomach empty and her body quieted, without daily demands of living. She felt she was making important discoveries. She was only 19 and had lost 20 pounds since marrying him. Naked, she was all ribcage and pelvis. He read her scribbled dreams, but they seemed to be senseless poems and gave him no clues to her. Snail slid down stones into rain. Owl fixes his eyes on hare and drops as if from the moon. Horse rides across the plains with his brother. In April, temperatures rose above 0 and then above 20. He strapped an extra battery to his pack and went to dig out the truck. Its excavation took all day. He drove it slowly back up the slushy road in the moonlight and asked if she'd like to go to town the next morning. To his surprise, she said yes. They heated water for baths and dressed in clothes they hadn't worn in 6 months. She threaded twine through her belt loop to keep her trousers up. Behind the wheel, his chest filled to have her with him, to be moving out in the country, to see the sun above the trees. Spring was coming. The valley was dressed up. "Look there," he wanted to say, "those geese streaming over the road. The valley lives, even after a winter like that." She asked him to drop her off at the library. He brought food, a dozen frozen pizzas, potatoes, eggs, carrots. He nearly wept at seeing bananas. In the parking lot, he drank half a gallon of milk. When he picked her up at the library, she applied for a library card and borrowed 20 books. They stopped at the Bitterroot for hamburgers and rhubarb pie. She ate 3 pieces. He watched her eat, the spoon sliding out of her mouth. This was better. This was more like his dreams. "Well, Mary," he said, "I think we made it." "I love pie," she said. As soon as the line was repaired, the phone began to ring. He took his fishing clients down the river. She sat on the porch reading and reading. Soon her sudden, ravenous appetite for books could not be met by the Great Falls Public Library. She wanted other books. Essays about sorcerers, primers on magic working and conjuring that had to be mail-ordered from New Hampshire, New Orleans, even Italy. Once a week, the hunter drove to town to collect a parcel of books from the post office. Arcana Mundi, the Seer's Dictionary, Paragon of Wizardry, Occult Science Among the Ancients. He opened one to random page and read, "Bring water, tie a soft fillet around your altar, burn it on fresh twigs and frankincense." She regained her health and took on energy. No longer lay under furs dreaming all day. She was out of bed before he was, brewing coffee, her news already between pages. With a steady diet of meat and vegetables, her body bloomed, her hair shone, her eyes and cheeks glowed. How beautiful she seemed to him in those few hours he was home. After supper, he would watch her read in the firelight. Blackbird feathers tied around her hair, a heron's beak hanging beneath their breasts. In November, he took a Sunday off. They cross-country skied. They came across a bull elk frozen to death in the draw. Ravens shrieked at them as they skied to it. She knelt and put her palm to the leathered skull. "There," she moaned. "I feel him." "What do you feel?" he asked, standing behind her. She stood trembling. "I feel his life flowing out. I see where he goes and what he sees." "But that's impossible. It's like saying you don't know what I dream." "I do," she said. "You dream about the wolves." "But that elk's been dead at least a day. It doesn't go anywhere. It goes into the crops of the ravens." How could she tell him? How could she ask him to understand such a thing? How could anyone understand? More clearly than ever, she could see that there was a fine line between dreams and wakefulness, between living and dying, a line so tenuous, it sometimes didn't exist. It was always clearest for her in winter. In that valley, life and death were not so different. The heart of a hibernating newt was frozen solid, so she could warm and wake it in her palms. For the newt, there was no line at all, no fence, no river Styx, only an area between living and dying, like snowfield between two lakes. A place where dreams and wakefulness met, where death was only a possibility, and visions rose shimmering to the stars like smoke. All that was needed was a hand, the heat of a palm, the touch of fingers. That February, the sun shone during the day, and ice formed at night. Slick sheets glazing the wheat fields, the roof, and roads. One day he dropped her off at the library, the chains on the tires rattling as he pulled away, heading back up the Missouri toward Fort Benton. Around noon, Marlin Spokes, a snowplow driver the hunter knew from grade school, slid off the Summer Ridge Bridge in his plow and dropped 40 feet in the river. He was dead before they could get him out of the truck. She was reading in the library and a block away, and heard the plow crash into the riverbed like 1,000 dropped girders. When she got to the bridge, sprinting in her jeans and t-shirt, men were already in the water. A telephone man from Helena, a jeweler, a butcher in his apron. All of them had scrambled down the banks and were wading in the rapids, prying the door open. Men lifted Marlin from the cab, stumbling as they carried him. Steam rose from their shoulders from the crushed hood of the plow. She careened down the snow-covered slope and splashed to them, her hand on the jeweler's arm, her leg against the butcher's leg, she reached for Marlin's ankle. When her fingers touched Marlin's body, her eyes rolled back. A single vision leaped to her. Marlin Spokes, pedaling a bicycle. A child's seat mounted over the rear tire with a helmeted boy. Marlin's own son, strapped to it. Spangles of light drifted over the river as they rolled down the lane beneath a giant, sprawling maple. The boy reached for Marlin's hair with one small fist. In the glass of a storefront window, their reflection flashed past. Fallen leaves turned over in their wake. This quiet vision, like a ribbon of rich silk, ran out slowly and fluidly. With great power, she stood beneath it. It was she who pedaled the bike. The boy's finger pulled through her hair. The men who were touching her or touching Marlin saw what she saw and felt what she felt. At first they spoke of it only in their basements at night, but Great Falls was not a big town. It was not something that could keep locked in a basement. Soon they discussed it everywhere. In the supermarket, at the gasoline pump. People didn't know Marlin Spokes, or his son, or the hunter's wife, or any of the men in the river that morning soon spoke of the event like experts. All you have to do is touch her, the barber said, and you saw it too. The most beautiful lane you've ever dreamed, a deli owner raved. You didn't just pedal his son around, the movie ushers whispered. You loved him. He couldn't have heard anywhere in the cabin he built up the fire, flipped idly through the stack of her books. He couldn't understand them. One of them wasn't even in English. After dinner, she took the plates to the sink. You read Spanish now? He asked. Her hands in silk stilled. It's Portuguese, she said. I understand only a little. She turned his fork in his hands. Were you there when Marlin Spokes was killed? I helped pull him out of the truck. I don't think I was much good. I looked at the back of her head. He felt like driving his fork through the table. What tricks did you play? Did you hypnotize people? Her shoulders tightened. Her voice came out furious. Why can't you? She began, but her voice fell off. It wasn't tricks, she muttered. I helped carry him. When she started to get the phone calls, he hung up on the callers. But they were relentless. A grieving widow, an orphan's lawyer, the reporter from the Great Falls Tribune. A blubbering father drove all the way to the cabin and begged her to come to the funeral parlor. And finally she went. The hunter insisted on driving her. It wasn't right, he declared, for her to go alone. He waited in the truck in the parking lot, engine rattling, radio moaning. I feel so alive, she said afterwards, as he helped her into the cab. Her clothes were soaked through with sweat, like my blood is fizzling through my body. At home she lay awake, far away at night. She got called back, and each time he drove her. He would take her after a whole day of duck hunting and pass out from exhaustion while he waited in his truck. When he woke, she would be beside him, holding his hand, her hair damp, her eyes wild. You dreamt you were with the wolves and eating salmon, she said. They were washing up and dying on the shoals. He drove them home over the dark fields. He tried to soften his voice. What do you do in there? What really? I give them solace. I let them say goodbye to their loved ones. I help them know something they'd never otherwise know. No, he said. I mean, what kind of tricks? How do you do it? She turned her hands palm up. As long as they're touching me, they see what I see. Come in with me next time. Go in there and hold hands. Then you'll know. He said nothing. The stars above the windshield seemed fixed in their place. Families wanted to pay her. Most wouldn't let her leave until they did. She would come up to the truck with $50, $100, once $400, folded in her pocket. She began to go off for weekends, disappearing in the truck before he was up. A fearless driver. She knelt by the roadkill. A crumpled porcupine. A shattered deer. She pressed her palm to the truck's grill, where the husks of insects smoked. Seasons came and went. She was gone half of the winter. Each of them was alone. They never spoke. On longer drives, she was sometimes tempted to keep the truck pointed away and never returned. In the first thaws, he would go out to the river and try to lose themselves in the rhythm of casting, in the sound of pebbles driven downstream, clattering together. But even fishing had become lonely for him. Everything, it seemed, was out of his hands. His truck, his wife, the course of his own life. As hunting season came on, his mind wandered. He was botching kills, getting upwind of elk, or telling the client to unload and call it quits 30 seconds before a pheasant burst from cover. When a client missed his mark and pegged the antelope in the neck, the hunter berated him for being careless, knelt over its track, and clutched at the bloody snow. "Do you understand what you've done?" he shouted. "How the arrow shafts will knock against the tree, how the animal will run, and how the wolves will trot behind it and keep it from resting?" The client was red-faced, huffing. "Wolves don't hunt here," the client said. "There haven't been wolves here for 20 years. She was in Butte or Missoula, when he discovered her money in a boot. $6,000 and change. He canceled his trips and stewed for 2 days, pacing on the porch, sifting through her things, rehearsing his arguments. When she saw him, the sheaf of bills jutting from his shirt pocket, she stopped halfway to the door, her bag over her shoulder, her hair pulled back. "It's not right," he said. She walked past him to the cabin. "I'm helping people. I'm doing what I love. Can't you see how good I feel afterwards?" "You take advantage of them. They're grieving, and you take their money." "They want to pay me," she shrieked. "I help them see something they desperately want to see." "It's a grift, a con." She came back on the porch. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet and strong. "This is real as anything in the valley. The river, the trout hanging in the crawl space. I have talent, a gift." He snorted. "A gift of hocus pocus for swindling widows out of their savings." He lobbed the money in the yard. The wind caught the bills and scattered them over the snow. She hit him at once, hard against the mouth. "How dare you?" she cried. "You of all people should understand. You who dreams of wolves every night." In the months that followed, she left the cabin more frequently, for longer durations, visiting homes, accident sites, and funeral parlors all over the central Montana. Finally, she pointed the trunk south and didn't turn back. They had been married 5 years. 20 years later, in the Bitterroot Diner, he looked at the ceiling-mounted television, and there she was, being interviewed. She lived in Manhattan, had traveled around the world, had written 2 books. She was in demand all over the country. "Do you commune with the dead?" the interviewer said. "No," she said. "I help people. I commune with the living. I give people peace." "Well," the interviewer said, turning to speak to the camera, "I believe it." The hunter brought her books at the bookstore and read them in one. The hunter bought her books at the bookstore and read them one night. She had written poems about the valley, written them to the animals. "You rampart coyote, you glorious buck." She had traveled to the Sudan and touched the backbone of a fossilized stegosaur and wrote of her frustration when she divined nothing from it. A TV network flew her to Kamchatka to embrace the huge, shaggy neck of a mammoth, and it was airlifted from the glacier. She had better luck with that one, describing an entire herd slogging big-footed through a slushy tide, tearing seagrass and flaring their ears to catch the sun. In a handful of poems, There were even vague allusions to him, a brooding, blood-soaked presence that hovered outside the margins like a storm in its way, like a killer hiding in the basement. The hunter was 50 years old. 20 years was a long time. The valley had diminished slowly, but perceptibly. The roads came in, the grizzlies left, seeking higher country. Loggers had thinned nearly every accessible stand of trees. Every spring runoff from logging roads turned the river chocolate brown, and the soil from the old forest from being washed into the Missouri. In his cabin, bent over the table, he set aside her books, took a pencil, and wrote her. In his cabin, bent over the table, he set aside her books, took a pencil, and wrote her a letter. A week later, a Federal Express truck drove all the way to the cabin. Inside the envelope was a response. On embossed stationery, the handwriting was hurried and efficient. "I will be in Chicago," it said, "day after tomorrow. Enclosed is a plane ticket. Feel free to come. Thank you for writing." After Sherbert the counselor called his guest into the reception room, burning candles had been distributed around the room. In the sills, the banister, the mantel, the bookshelves, the bar had been taken down. In its place, 3 caskets had been sent on the carpet. A bit of snow had fallen on the lid. They must have been kept out. It was melting, and drops ran onto the carpet, where they left dark circles. Around the casket, cushions had been placed on the floor. The hunter leaned against the entryway and watched guests drift uncomfortably into the room, some cradling coffee cups, others gulping at gin or vodka in deep tumblers. Eventually, everyone settled on the floor in the circle. The hunter's wife came in, elegant in her dark suit. She knelt and motioned for O'Brien to sit next to her. Her face was pinched and inscrutable. Again, the hunter had the impression that he was not of this world, but of a slightly leaner one. "President O'Brien," his wife said, "I know this is difficult for you. Death can seem so final, like a blade dropped through the neck. But the nature of death is not at all final. It's not some dark cliff which we leap. I hope to show you it is merely a fog, something we can peer into and out of, something we can know and face and not necessarily fear. But each life taken from our collective lives, we are diminished. But even in death, we have much to celebrate. It is only transition, like so many others." She moved into the circle, unfastened the lid of the casket. From where he sat, the hunter could not see inside. His wife's hands fluttered around her waist like birds. "Think," she said. "Think hard about something you would like to resolve, some matter gone now in the grips of the past, which you wish you could take back. Perhaps your daughter, a moment, a lost feeling, a desperate wish." The hunter closed his eyes. "Think now," his wife said, "of something wonderful, of some wonderful moment, some fine, sunny minute you shared with your wife and daughters, all of you together." Her voice was lulling. Behind his eyelids, the glow of candles made even orange wash. He knew her hands were reaching for whoever lay in those caskets. Somewhere inside him, he felt her extend across the room. His wife said more about beauty and loss being the same thing, about how they ordered the world and how he felt something happening, a strange warmth, a flittering presence, something dim and unsettling, like a feather brushed across the back of his neck. Hands on both sides of him reached for his hands, fingers locked around his fingers. He wondered if she was hypnotizing him, but it didn't matter. He had nothing to fight off or snap out of. She was inside him now. She had reached across and was poking about. Her voice faded, and he felt himself swept up as if rising toward the ceiling. Air washed lightly out of his lungs, and warmth pulsed in the hands that held his. In his mind, he saw a sea emerging from fog. The water was broad and flat and glittered like polished metal. He could feel dune grass moving against his shins and wind coming over his shoulders. All around him, bees shuttled over the dunes. Far out, a shorebird was diving for crabs. He knew that a few hundred yards away, two girls were building castles in the sand. He could hear their song, soft and lilting. Their mother was with them, reclining under an umbrella, one leg bent, the other straight. She was drinking iced tea, and he could taste it in his mouth, sweet bitter with a trace of mint. Each cell in his body seemed to breathe. He became the girls, the diving bird, the shuttling bees. He was like the mother of the girls and the father. He could feel himself flowing outward, richly dissolving, paddling into the world like a very first cell of the great blue sea. When he opened his eyes, he saw linen curtains, women in growling knees. Tears were visible on many people's cheeks. O'Brien and the Chancellor and Bruce Maples. His wife's head was bowed. The hunter gently released the hands that held his, stood and walked into the kitchen, past a steady sink and the stacks of dishes. He let himself out a side door and found himself on a wooden deck that ran the length of the house. A couple of inches of snow already settled in. He felt drawn toward the pond, the bird bath, the hedges. He walked to the pond and stood at its rim. The snow fell steadily, and the underside of the clouds glowed with reflected light from the city. Before long, his wife stepped into the deck and came down to join him. There were things that had been prepared to say, something about final belief, an expression of gratitude for providing a reason to leave the valley. If only for a night. He wanted to tell her that although the wolves were gone, and may always have been gone, they still came to him in dreams, and that they could run, fierce and unfettered, was surely enough. She would understand. She had understood long before he did. But he was afraid to speak. He could see that speaking would be like dashing some very fragile bond to pieces, like kicking a dandelion gone to seed. The wispy, tenuous sphere of its body would scatter in the wind. So instead they stood together, the snow fluttering down from the clouds to melt the water, where their reflected images trembled like two people trapped against the glass of a parallel world. And he reached, finally, to take her hand.